Thank you all, Felix and all the conveners for this wonderful invitation and opportunity to discuss histories of geographies and places and positioning in regards to what I'm working on in Berlin in this very specific project that I've been working on for the last 3 years on colonial provenance of zoological collections, which is also a very public and political topic. I would also like to because I am in Berlin and this is also my positioning, it is a privilege to work with the Humanities of Nature Center and Ina Heumann, and it is obviously for me a wonderful opportunity also to be able to seriously consider the impact and meanings of zoological collections for especially this idea of how we humans relate to nature, but also regarding Western epistemologies. In that sense, I'm also going to be looking at a lot of maps, as you can also see here. I won't be able to show a bunch of images that I would have liked since as maybe most of you know, the Berlin Museum is currently offline. I'm lucky to be online today, so that's something that happened a couple of weeks ago. We got our internet back. I will share my screen and try to get things going. I prepared my presentation for around 40 minutes, so I hope everything is okay with visualization of the slides. And so again, thank you, Felix, for letting me sort of not just wrap up a paper that I'm writing for this project that has to do with Cameroon. And I've taken the liberty of adding to the chat a couple of links. One for the geographers and cartographers and colonial historians is a link it's a web online platform in German, but that connects a bunch of colonial cartography of the German colonial space, sorry. And so you can actually use it to input nomenclature, like a locality name, and find it in maps and zoom in through different layers of different scales of the maps available. It's not all the maps in the world, but a lot of these sort of propagandistic colonial materials, and it's a really good repositorium. And so what we've tried to do, for example, in my project was to also show these resources to the curators and the collection managers in the mammal collection, so that we can think about how to connect all of these repositories, all of this information that is, let's say, readily digitally available, and how can we also work on it today. So my work really is a part of historical considerations, but then also trying to figure out the role and positions of museums, of these Western institutions filled with authority and power on so this sort of relationship with nature. And so this is why you see my Gmail account in my email, because, well, I'm now back using my MFN email, but it was offline for a long time. So this, just makes us all also consider the possibilities and limitations of the digital world and of all of these technologies. So I'm going to talk about how catalogues and cataloging categories influence how collections are built, but mostly how collections are accessed. And zoological collections are organized usually with taxonomical ordering systems, but I am looking for the geographical and therefore colonially charged localities in these catalogues. So this talk is going to be about collections, but don't worry, there's lots of maps. I want to take this opportunity to really think with you about the larger role of natural history collections and how we need to resituate and replace scientific collections and the act of collecting within the history of knowledge. This is a talk about the history of the convoluted political and cultural relationship between people, places, and nature. Yes. Thanks to curators, environmental and colonial historians, and geographers, in the last decade, the literature has become rife in establishing connections between the history of ecologies and the histories of violence, inequality, and logistics of power. At the same time as European and Western museums have seen their logics and politics of collecting and accessioning questioned and criticized by several public reports, the importance of restitution of human remains, religious artifacts, and culturally salient objects from the global south, which are considered in the global north, which are which are stored in the global north. This is kind of sort of the context for my argument. That will be that no other collections, even though human remains and religious artifacts are much more salient, reflect more the standing of Western values of private property and ownership than collections of samples of nature itself, particularly when we consider the size and scope of large-scale collections such as is the Berlin Museum. I'm talking about natural history collections, which include mineral, fossil, animal, and plant collections, but certainly also extending collecting to all ethnological collections that have a connection with these. What is now commonly referred to as biocultural collections and archives, but then also all of the connections that most of the collecting of these have to do with also the collecting or the extraction of human remains, etc. So territory, geographies of human and animal and plant life, and landscapes themselves have entered scientific collections as recontextualized, reconfigured, and reimagined Platonic devices that substituted the living world in a particular semiotic relationship. In my work, I focus on the practices and values behind collection management practices of these large-scale collections, such as is the Berlin Museum, which has an estimated size of 30 million objects. Half of it is insects, you guys, it's fine. And in the mammal collection that I am have been working with for the last 3 years, the estimated size is 120 to 150,000 specimens. Therefore, the spaces I want to inspect are the storages and collection rooms, not so much the exhibition rooms and the items on public display, which consider less than 1% of the collections. Storage rooms are still understood today as a representation of the natural world within inside their four walls. What once was outside, living, breathing, and shaping mountains, valleys, forests, islands, and the sea, is reconfigured into discrete conventional forms and pieces that await interpretation from biologists, paleontologists, and taxonomists. Why they are there, these pieces, and no longer in their natural habitats is clear to all researchers who claim that it is through these museum collections that the diversity and multiple nature of nature's variability can best be observed, measured, transformed into pieces of information, and then valuable data. However, as you can see in the slide, many voices, particularly from taxonomists, have lately insisted that closer attention needs to be paid to the various biases that have produced these collections and shaped those storage rooms. So the larger mission of understanding the outside world and its changes over time is now also clearly understood as a direct result of predetermined and preconceived systems of knowledge and knowledge gathering. So these are a few titles available in the literature written by curators and taxonomists of different types of collections. And they say, for example, unfortunately, due to limited data availability, the majority of reviews of climate change impacts, suffer from severe taxonomic and geographical biases. This is in Feely, the paper from 2017. So therefore, for their perspective in this discipline, which is also what I kind of study, is the contemporary discipline of taxonomy, a direct correlation is found between the available data sets in collection and museums, which are described here as limited and restricted, and correlated with the geographical access to such data sets. And most importantly, one of these texts expresses also that consequently, Quote, for many purposes, researchers need to refer back to the primary data sources, in particular museum holdings, catalogues, etc. But how complete and consistent are these different sources? And now I underline this, how easy is it to obtain this information? So we all know that museum managers, as archivists and librarians, have been through a lot of changes in the last generations, in the current generations, in terms of what is transparency and access to catalogs. However, we still have a lot to to work on. So the underlying problem seems to me to be a double point about what is access. The first point is that historically, access to large collection sets, such as the one in Berlin, was mostly obtained via colonial logistics and unbalanced power relationships, which resonates in all collected specimens and gathered data, therefore. The second point is access to the information about these circumstances. Even today, as we discuss digital reparations, how can we properly talk about transparency and sustainable access to collections which are still stored in different geographies from whence they were once sourced, from whence all of these specimens were once sourced? Just a side point, geographical and archival bias is, of course, also present in the literature of history of environment, as well as history of collections. As we know, the British case studies, British India Company or the British Empire has shaped the field in a dramatical and often overlooked way. And so these sources for the discipline gathering, the shaping of disciplines is also something that we should also always sort of have a meta-reflexive instinct towards. Sorry. Those 2 points about access noticeably persist in the now very public discussions of the role of Western museums. Both history of collections as history of colonial collecting no longer take an approach of looking into the crucial function of logistics and the hierarchies of circulation of goods, people, and information or ideas, or just looking at circulation. Rather, the focus has shifted recently to a serious inspection on capitalistic practices of possession and property, and to the instances of extraction and violent displacement of people, things, and nature. So therefore, I take scientific zoological collections as part of the colonial archive. And I try to offer a place to think with my project about what happens when we look at zoological specimens as remains of biological individual animals who were not allowed to die or be buried where they once lived. The point of large-scale sets of specimens like these in the storage rooms in the mammal collections of Berlin, which, by the way, everyone is invited. If you come to Berlin, please let me know. I'll be very happy to take you through all of these cool rooms. Well, cool. The point of these large sets of specimens like these is to have life frozen in time and ready for close inspection, following certain conventions based on the paradigms of compared anatomy. So large series of skulls were positioned side by side in order to highlight difference and similitude and evaluate interspecific variability. So this is the research agenda that fed the field of biogeography, which is what I'm going to talk about. This particular mode of knowledge production is collection-based. And it's based, therefore, on the description of particularly cranial differences as one of, and therefore, is, we could argue, one of the most successful and productive modes of production of knowledge, still remaining from racial sciences and racial theory. So I'm going to go now into sort of talking about Paul Macchi, a curator in the Berlin Museum. I realized recently that I no longer use photos of men and biographical details, but he was born in 1861, died in 1926, and started working at the Berlin Museum. He's the nice chap on the left of the screen. And he started working at the mammal collection as collection manager and curator in 1895, where the same year as he published the fauna of German East Africa, a very illustrated, very well illustrated, edited volume, volume illustrated by his wife, whom he also married the same year, Anna Held. So in this photo, I'm sorry, in this quote and in this photography, we have kind of the summary of Paul Machi's scientific agenda, as well as a series of questions on access, I would argue. Access to live animals. Here he is 10 hours away from Berlin by train, looking at African gnus. So access to live animals in order to study behavior, development, and locomotion, for example, as we can see here. Here we see Machi, who was born in Berlin, 10 hours away from Berlin, together with director of the Berliner Zoo, Ludwig Heck, and a custodian of this wonderful menagerie that he had access to. Places such as zoological collections and museums, zoological gardens, and menageries such as these provided an exclusive access to African fauna without all the hassle of the steamer voyages. So here access is again both a matter of place as it is a matter of social class and cultural interest. In his quote, this is in the beginning of his career, 1896, and he's addressing the Geographical Society or Association here in Berlin. And so therefore he's claiming that there's a lot of points in common between geographers and zoologists. And he says, yes, there are still many zoological museums today where very little attention is paid to geography. In this quote, he attempts to establish the bridges between what he and his colleagues were doing with the museum collections and the overall geographical knowledge, which was established, as you know, in the 19th century as both part of the construction of national identities, especially in Europe, and also as a discipline that was capable of global impact and global sort of results. So how did African collections grew in numbers in the Berlin Museum? How were the incoming shipments appraised and evaluated? And what were the scientific contributions to biogeography that these collections offered? To answer some of these questions and to, I hope, raise many more, I'm going to focus on a very specific geopolitical space, Cameroon. So particularly what is called German Cameroon. So I'll use the expression, the phrase German Cameroon a lot in order to, that will become clear in a bit, to express a much larger and dynamic type of territory than what is today the Republic of Cameroon. So let's start with some context from general museum policies. And also with an illustration by Anna Held, who I just mentioned. She worked both with the collections as an illustrator here in the Berlin Museum and extensively with the zoological garden. So she was able to produce illustrations that captured live animals as well as specimens, or dead animals, as we can also call them. So side by side with Machi, she illustrated dozens of publications with hundreds of images of specimens, details of live animals in their zoo enclosures, and diagrammatic illustrations of species. She also published on her own the paper Observations on the Gait of Ungulates, Observations from Deer and Antelope Enclosures in the Zoological Garden, about structures of hooves and specific characteristics of gait in antelopes. This is not always mentioned, so I'd kind of take the opportunity here to mention that she also is a published author. This is one of her colored sketches. There we have a large series in the archive here, where we can see an example of the individual of an individual animal, of a jackal, who is depicted and received two different qualifications in the little notes. So it's West African. It's written there, West African jackal. So West African has a geographical distinction to separate between the species and the subspecies and all of the families, etc. And then as also having as being a present, Geschenk is the word there, a present or a gift from colonial officer Hans Dominic. And you can maybe see the word Dominic before the date 1897. Hans Dominic was an implicated German commander of the so-called Schutztruppe, and head of many of the so-called punitive expeditions, and a well-known enactor of vicious violence in the territories of German Cameroon. He was also a keen dispatcher of live animals to Berlin. To the right, you have a citation from the director of the Zoological Museum in 1906, August Brauer, who followed Möbius as director of all of the zoological collections. And he writes in his year report for 1905 that it is thanks to the support of the colonial department and of the Foreign Office and the willingness of so many officials and officers, colonial officials and officers, to make sacrifices that the museum has unquestionably gained the first place, which is something that is very interesting to analyze in the discourses of directors, how people talk about the first tier and the second tier of zoological museums in the 19th century. So this Berlin is now, we're told, the first place among all museums on Earth with regard to African animals in most of its departments. So this is now a section I decided to call The More the Better. In the same year, Brauer continues to say that, for example, in the mammal department, the collection, and he specifically says that this follows the section where he specifically says that Berlin is now better than London. So just so you know. The collection has grown to such an extent, he says, that the clear arrangement of all the new accessions became a challenge. So spatial rearrangements made in the previous year were no longer sufficient. This is also a constant in museum reports, not just the demands or the making clear for funding purposes and for budget augmentations that more space is needed, but also the interesting competition between departments within an institution. So therefore, it's interesting that they had to install supports for deer antlers in one of the rooms that was intended for the bird collection. And as you know, if you know the work that Ina Heumann and my colleagues here in Berlin have done on the history of the dinosaur, on the big dinosaur, book is coming soon in its English translation. You will be happy to know. It was first published in German and then in Swahili. And now the English version is coming. If you have read the book, you'll see, or if you can read in the forthcoming English version, how interesting is sort of also the discussion and debate and confrontations about space between the mammals and the dinosaurs, because this was the main hall of the museum was a mammal hall and it became a dinosaur hall. Still today it is called the Sauriersaal. And to the left, one of the many, many, many photos in the photo archive that we also have. These sort of displays, just to mention, of sort of trophy-like displays, was very, very, very common in museums, in zoological museums. And I'm just going to go back a bit. This, because I didn't mention that, this is the new storage room that is supposed to be kind of in the terms of concept of an open storage room, which, as I'm sure most of you know, is very controversial, I would say, for to take all these sorts of options in the design of new buildings or new spaces in the building. And so the Berlin Museum is really a good example of where we can really think about how museums also design themselves. And so here it's hard in this room not to use the word trophy. And so what many museums tried to hide for decades, zoological museums, who passed all of these collections from their walls, wall displays such as here, to hidden storage rooms, it will now in a couple of years be made public and very public. And I look forward to the hopefully public discussions about that as well, as how the museum is going to put on display its millions of specimens in a way that is going to be rather overwhelming. 10 years later, Brauer says, We're in 1916 now, right in the middle of World War I, and he says, or the Great War, even if as a result of the war. So we're still talking about the expansion of the collection. The arrangement of the collection has by no means reached the same amount as in time of peace. The museum has nevertheless received some very valuable additions, thanks to generous supports from various parties. And he mentions something that we also know and we're currently working on, the accession of objects and large collections from the war zones, and as exactly Brouwer says here, some of which collected in the trenches. So this is a different topic that Ina Heumann is also now working on. So the connections between natural history collection expansion and war zones. And so that's going to be a very exciting topic for the next years, I'm sure. So Brouwer says this, but in our analysis of the accession catalog, just for the mammal collections, and the numbers you see are numbers of shipments, not numbers of specimens. So each shipment can represent from 1 to 200 animals. We see that, in fact, there was a decrease in accession after the war as things started to sort of pace down a bit, but in the high time of especially African presence of the German colonial empire, the amount of shipments per week and per day are outstanding. So this is just one department in the whole of the zoological department. You can see as some years have over 5 shipments per week. So a shipment per day minimum. These are just the logged ones in this accession catalog that we worked with. So in order to compare all of these characteristics that animals have and be able to sort of distinguish between where there's a species and where does the other species start in terms of the their geographical distribution, which is the basic sort of agenda of biogeography. There's a need for a lot of comparison material. But we do find some unbridled quotes by Machi in the sources that I always am very keen to share because it's so shocking. He says, from the genets, we only have 600 skins. It is important to strive with all our power to get forms. So he means the interspecific variability, or the idea that he could then distinguish with more specimens, more subspecies, for example. And so the idea is that these are collections that are not just trying to be complete in the sense of representing the living world, but exhaustive in terms of really finding very individualized differences and similitudes. And this is again a drawing from Anna Held. So what happened when shipments came, especially from the colonial world? In 1890, Berlin centralized the inflow of collections, or rather the colonial government did that. And so Berlin was, and there's lots of literature now about this, sort of a central stage, and where everything needed to come to be assessed and evaluated. So most things come through Hamburg, but then it's in Berlin that they would then be separated into the 3 main museums that were handling all of these collections that came from specifically the colonial territories. The Ethnographical Museum, the Zoological Museum, and the Botanical Museum. So under Zoological Museum, I think we can also understand that there was also geological and fossil collections, but those are the 3 institutions. And at that time, so therefore, not just because of the size and amount of shipments that was incoming, but also because there needed to be a distribution. If you have too many of one thing, you have to then redistribute from Berlin to the other natural history museums in Germany. So there's a lot of interinstitutional competition that is also very interesting to observe in the nitty-gritty of how things were actually not distributed at all, for example. So curators had to draw up these accession reports. And I've looked at many of the accession report annotations that Machi, the mammal curator, did, and he has to make a justification on the scientific value in order to accession these collections. And more often than not, 9 out of 10 times or more, his scientific justification hinges on geographical value. So, for example, here he says that within this shipment from Lage, from Cameroon, this is all going to be from Cameroon, 2 species are new to the collection. For the knowledge of the mammal of so this is very valuable for a knowledge of the mammal fauna of South Cameroon is considerably valuable. So it's not just about having a species represented, but where do they come from? So we're not really just collecting animal species, rather origins, geographical origins. That's what's being collected, because that's what in the mind of Archie and his scientific research agenda is what's going to then bring more valuable data in the interpretation of all these objects. So again, for example, I have a couple of these citations just to show you how in these bureaucratical paper that really is attached to all of these collection boxes, but no longer attached today. There's a production of meaning that is attached to these papers. So this is a justification that is bureaucratical. This is the secretariat of the direction that draws up these reports and then asks each of the curator, and they have 1 month to reply and to assess the incoming boxes, which was a big flow of boxes. And so again, Machi says here in 1901, the shipment is all the more valuable because not a single mammal from northwest Cameroon was known thus far. So all of these things obviously need to be taken with a grain of salt, but it is interesting, this particular quote, also because he uses a lot the language of the vocabulary of evidence and proof. So specimens are also the material evidence that something exists in a place. So they, again, are stuck in time as a preserved evidence, as preserved proof that a living, mobile animal was once in one specific place. So locality has to be a very crucial then metadata for each of these individual specimens. So much so that even when 3 skins arrived still wet and smelled very foul, it was still possible to tend them. And so Machi says they will therefore remain useful for our collection. So very welcome. This is an expression he uses a lot. Very welcome because of where they are found. They were found. So there's a lot of other quotations and other for example, Brouwer, just to again make clear that the connection between shipments and the colonial presence and military stations is very one-to-one. So we talk a lot about in collecting histories of scientific expeditions and the overwhelming expression of scientific expedition material in museums. But these are all scientific collecting events that happen within a very specific, and usually it is, to say the least, it's a capitalistic adventure as well. And so here, for example, Brouwer in 1913 formally requested to the colonial government an authorization that the imperial colonial expedition to the Muni region, which would take place between 13 and 1914, that the lead of this expedition, Georg Escherich, was allowed to hunt gorillas, elephants, buffaloes, and antelopes. This means he's asking that the scientist that is also a military person in this colonial expedition would have allotted time and paid permits to hunt. So Brouwer claims that it would be of great scientific value for the Berlin Museum to obtain specimens of gorillas, especially since he said, quote, "The first gorilla ever known to science comes from this region," end of quote. So therefore, it is scientifically relevant to obtain more representatives, and quote Brouwer again, to be able to compare them exactly with the gorillas living in southern Cameroon and attain a better description. So not only is this particular space, and I'm going to show a couple of more maps in a bit about the Cameroonian sort of fluidity of territories. And this particular time, 1913, is when the Germans have extended the borders of German Cameroon to include the spaces around what is today Equatorial Guinea. And therefore, gorillas, for example, are part of not just the scientific agenda, but then also this political appropriation of territory that comes with it. So I'm not going to expand too much on gorillas, but this just to show you. So the link I shared in the chat is the link I'm using here, for example, to identify where Edea is on the map, or in colonial cartography. And I am aware that we often say, because Beinart also said in The Rise of Conservation in South Africa, he mentions that African names never appear in colonial cartography because they're not meant to. Here, what we see, and especially in scientific catalogues, is some of the African names being translated to German, for example, or to any of the other Western languages or colonial languages in order to reinforce appropriation. So here, for example, we have a really interesting map. This is the Große Deutsche Kolonialatlas, so the colonial atlas. And in the same place, we also see, I don't know if it's too small on your screens, and I apologize for that, but you also see not just a mishmash of local names that are often repeated. It's very hard to make sense of any of these annotations. These are annotations made in Routenaufnahmebücher, so in books that are meant to really record that some of these officials had with them to record meters and steps that they would take every day, and how long did it take to get to specific places. So, as you know, maps can be made of different types of lists and different types of visualizations. In this one, we also have people and the presence of all of these expeditions. So I've highlighted on this particular one a couple of names that you can see that relate to specific expeditions, and sometimes specific punitive expeditions and violent reenactments of colonial confrontation in these regions. So maps hide a lot of information, but they also actually sometimes use a lot of this information. Doesn't mean that by using local names or very particularized individuals here, there is any semblance of an egalitarian or respectful communication between what is the Western epistemologies and what is Western kind of approved information and versus indigenous knowledge or local information or locally obtained information. It just means that it is another way to effect territorial appropriation. As is, and this I also mentioned in my PhD already, as is the connection between names of people, names of places, and local, in inverted commas, and local names for specific animals. So when zoologists use these names of localities of the colonial officers that are responsible for the shipments, but then also of the local naming, or what we could say local nomenclatures, of certain specific species, it does not mean that they are taken as either valuable or as equitative in this equation. They not necessarily. This is also a means of saying of being very specific and convincing by using detail that these colonial officers were in the specific places that they are, and therefore they authenticate all the metadata that comes with these evidences of the presence of animals, which also mean the presence of people. So a little bit about Cameroon. In the 17th century, Portuguese sailors that were going to Goa charted this part of the Guinean bay, falling up, don't remember the name, of this part of the coast, of the Guinean coast. Or Guinea is also a very weird descriptor for this. Anyway, in the 17th century, Portuguese navigators described this coast as Camarões, a river of Camarões, in fact, because this is where they landed their boat, and there were a lot of shrimps to be sold and to be seen, apparently, in this particular place where they landed boats. And this specific sort of imperialistic way of describing it from your own perspective, or from the Western side's perspective, remained in the maps in Western cartography. And it's, again, a brilliant example of the naming and charting violence of Europeans' advances in the African continent. So the idea of Cameroon, and this is another example of what I would describe violent cartography, and not just colonial cartography. This is a map of Cameroon that does not have a title. The title doesn't describe Cameroon. The title describes the map of the Morocco Treaty, because there was a treaty signed between France and Germany, two colonial powers in this specific region, in 1911, that because Germany recognized Morocco as French, the French sort of bequeathed what was their perceived territory to Germany. And so this is a map that is only valid for a very specific time, and this is the map that I showed earlier as well. And so between 1911 and 1917, all of the collections and all of the expeditions and military missions that happened in the territory of Cameroon were focusing on this expansion of the territory, and therefore a lot of problems arise in the catalogues of zoological collections, as I will also mention in a bit. I'll just pass a bit of these. These are other examples of other representations of Cameroon, and I'm going to talk about this one now. So in the chat, we also put then the link for this paper that we recently published with Paul Taku-Bizong last year on the mammalian type material from Cameroon here at the MFN. So we tried to do what Paul did was an assessment of the mammal collection, extracting from the digital catalog anything that had these two conditions: under country, Cameroon. So country is a controlled vocabulary field. So Cameroon, and then status for type. So which means the wonderfully symbolic specimens that represented, or that were used rather, for to describe a new species or a new subspecies, which by the way Machi did a lot. So he was an effective splitter, as we say. And so therefore, we looked at the mammal collection, not from a taxonomical perspective or approach, but from a geographical approach. And this makes this paper rather unique and original, because it is not a presentation of the type material from the point of view of an expertise on a specific family or group or genus, but rather on a specific territory. And what we found is, and I'm sorry, that's kind of my doodle in the left, what you have is, on top of one of these maps of Cameroon, I've plotted some of the type localities that we described in this paper. And 3 of them are one in, well, two of them I think appear in the paper because the paper only describes the valid species names. But two of them still had Cameroon in the controlled vocabulary field in the digital catalog, but are actually, it's a locality actually in today's Nigeria, and the other one in the Central African Republic. So therefore, what we looked at is trying to get not just to the shipment level. That's what I managed to do in my project because of the large scale of influx of all of these specimens, and because I was also looking for how can we describe mass? How can we describe this sort of scale of number of specimens? And in this paper and this work, we looked at 97 specific specimens, really looked at them, really touched them, and really assessed all of the historical labels, all of the inscriptions in bone, etc. And to sort of make more visible the number of type specimens from a specific region that are stored in a completely different continent. And so therefore, we could talk about digital reparations. We could talk about digital opportunities for the interpretation of these collections, but mostly we need to discuss what does access mean, because without this kind of reorganization or reorientation of the catalog lists, there is no access to this particular information on what specifically is where, because that's a very specific question that we had, or that Paul had. I only assisted, and that we were able to sort of at least start the conversation with this paper. So therefore, we are very proud of this short 6-month project and the results that we already got. Another thing that Paul helped me with was in one of the specimens I was looking for a paper on a specific 33 specimens that were used for the colonial hunting exhibition in 1903, was that the verbatim locality from the inscriptions in the bone said Sanaga, which we already knew as a river in Cameroon, but a long, very long river, a river system. And then it says Sanaga between Na Dinata and Dandungu. And so that's, maybe I can do this. No, it doesn't work. Sorry. So I tried to ask Paul, this is a very weird description. Can we find out more about this description? And how can we inspect colonial literature in order to understand what this specific location of Cameroon is? And we produced this work hypothesis where he identified Dandangu as possibly Anadnungu, one of the obas of one of the villages that is located by this river system. And in this specific language, or in this ethno-linguistic group, Ginata means His Excellency. So in our work hypothesis, which is not possible to really test, because we know that there's a lot of errors in transcription and understanding and local languages and transcribing them to German or Western languages, we kind of interpreted these words as meaning not really another place, but a realm, a territory of an Oba, or a sovereign in this region. So what is interesting is, of course, to notice that in the label, it says Sanaga between and then Nadinata Dandungu. But in the verbatim locality, the operator wrote Zanaga between, and then they felt they had to add something that has to be between one thing and the other. And they added they added and, where actually it is nowhere to be seen in the specimen or in the label. So there's a lot of problems in looking in detail into these categories, into these descriptions, but mostly I'm very interested on why aren't more taxonomists interested in getting really detailed and very, very, very precise localities for these so-called historical collections. And in fact, they often tell me in interviews that they don't need more precision. It's fine as it is. But I find that very, very interesting, and therefore I got very interested in the catalogization of all these localities. Again, how Cameroon can be described via lists of places, which sometimes are accompanied by maps, but not necessarily maps. Maps are not the only expression of localities and presence. And then here, the distribution of mammals, a book by Machi in 1903, accompanied with a lot of maps and a lot. He was really great with, in terms of popularization of science. Everything he publishes is illustrated and with like things that come out and pop up. It's really fascinating also to talk about that, but just Machi's interpretation, and we can represent Cameroon, this territory, with all these different, from all these different perspectives of all these different disciplines. Ethno-linguistic groups distribution, geological riches distribution, and where they are placed in the territory, etc. And then here, Machi is using this kind of weird system of horizontal lines and vertical lines and diagonal lines in order to express what he called the influences from other regions. So what he's talking about here is how the territories for biogeographical research were actually being mathematized. And we are trying to, or we were trying to distinguish how many vertebrates or how many mammal families can be found in Africa as opposition with, for example, South America. And why are there different numbers? Or within Africa and above the equator or below the equator, or here in this very particular transition space that Cameroon kind of represents between forest and desert and the coast in Africa. So, and then also how collections are a confirmation or are evidence or are the reification, if you want, of all these theories, of all these ideas that Machi was discussing about how species distribute, how mobile they are or not, and how that influences on them, their interspecific variability and their evolution and into different species or speciation. Again, here talking about very specific locations is also always the highlight. And then, for example, here the idea that there needs to be more specimens in order to fill the gaps in the collection. So the collection has never enough material. And then this really interesting expression or phrase that he uses in scientific terms, a very instructive plunder. And of course, plunder is what my colleagues at the TU here in Berlin are discussing when they're discussing the ethnographical collections, and how Germany holds 40,000 items or collection numbers from Cameroon alone. Just to give you an idea, the British Museum and the Paris Museum or the Quai Branly Museum have around the same number for the whole continent of Africa. And those are, you know, the large scale collections that we know in terms of ethnographical collections. So plundering is quite interesting that here it's being sort of neutralized as an idea that it is a scientific term. In scientific terms, a very instructive plunder for these collections. So to sort of wrap up, and I hope I'm not too over the time. I am. I'm sorry for that. Just a conclusion on how Africa was represented in the development of the 19th century as empty spaces and really open for the construction of Western myths of whether it is religious missions or progress and civilization, and how zoological museums were so much a part of this, whether by their displays, where here we have an Asian elephant, an African elephant, next to ethnographical material. This is here in Berlin in the Zoological Museum, probably in the 50s. This photo is not dated, so the 1950s, and how unbridled all of this discourse and narratives were, unashamed of having and possessing and having the property of these things that, again, are here in Berlin, stored in a couple of basements and attics in this museum. And so I'll wrap up here and look forward to your questions and to the comments and to the discussion that we're going to have. Thank you so much.